Hi everybody, and welcome back to class. This video is the first in a series of lectures that's going to correspond to April 21st, 2020. And today what we're going to talk about is problem-oriented policing. So I talked a little bit about problem-oriented policing last week. I said we were going to focus heavily on it this week. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to lecture for probably about 45 minutes, go through what problem-oriented policing is and the SARA model of problem-oriented policing. And then once I finish my lecture, what I'm going to do is point you to that Pop Center website that I sent you to last week, and you're actually going to complete a problem-oriented policing module where you're going to try to use some of the skills you've learned about problem-oriented policing and apply them to a fictitious scenario where we have a police department who's engaged in problem-oriented policing to address a prostitution problem. All right, but I'll talk more about that at the end of the lecture. For now, what I want to do is I want to go back in time, quite a few years in time, and I want to talk a little bit about the first police department, the first formal police department around the world, which is the London Metropolitan Police. So in this picture here, we're looking at Scotland Yard, which was the London Met's police headquarters. And I bring the London Met up because what I want to do is take a look at a quote from the first commissioner of the London Metropolitan Police. He says that the primary objective of an efficient police is the prevention of crime, the next that of detection and punishment of offenders if a crime is committed. And to these ends, all efforts of police must be directed. And as I said, this is from the commissioner of the first formal police agency, and this was spoken in 1829. And I bring this up because police agencies in the United States really modeled how they were made up based on the London Met model. And so for the London Metropolitan Police, right, for Sir Richard Mayne and for Sir Robert Peel, who was British Home Secretary, who was responsible for crafting the legislation that formalized the London Met, the way this was going to be accomplished was through what I talked about last week, which is the standard model of policing, which relies on routine patrols premised on the idea that if police are out patrolling in a random way, they're going to convey this sense of omnipresence, or that the police could be anywhere at any time, or what's also been referred to as an unremitting watch, right? That watch is always there, and this is meant to deter offenders. Rapidly responding to calls for police service. So anyone that becomes a police officer, one of the first jobs you're going to have is to be a patrol officer in whatever department you choose, aside from some federal agencies. And what you're going to be doing over the course of your shift is responding to 911 calls. When I was a police officer in Staten Island, in the largest police precinct in the entire NYPD. And I started my shift and I started responding to calls for service. And there were few days where I was able to end my shift without having to go into backlog, which means that I was actually handing off calls to the shift that followed my shift. And so I was unable to keep up with the number of 911 calls that were coming in. And so rapid response was kind of built into my job because I had to quickly dispose of cases so I could keep taking reports and respond to calls as they come in. But for the standard model of policing, this idea that we need to get to the scene of the crime as quickly as possible as a means of identifying and detaining offenders and therefore reducing crime, right? This is the premise of rapid response under the standard model of policing, that it can have a crime reduction benefit. And then finally, that last part that I talked about last week, retroactive investigations, where after a crime occurs, we're going to go back and we're going to try to identify who that offender is and to hold them accountable for the crime that they committed. Right, so these are the three prongs of the standard model of policing. And of course, last week we talked about the standard model of policing, and what we learned was that the standard model of policing is ineffective in preventing crime from occurring. So despite the fact that even today in the United States, the majority of police agencies follow this standard model of policing, we know that it's an ineffective way to prevent crime from happening. In terms of how we know these things, right? Just looking at routine patrol last week, I talked about the Kansas City Preventative Patrol experiment, and I discussed that how this was designed was there were 3 different conditions that were examined. Police patrols were doubled in some sectors, they were kept at standard levels in other sectors, and then removed completely from another group of sectors. And the results of this study suggest that regardless of whether you double, keep at the same level, or remove patrols, there was no difference in the level of crime across the different conditions. And I talked about Kansas City's experience last week, but also during this time in the 80s, when Kansas City was in the 70s, but into the 1980s, we also looked at a couple of other experiments in the United States, such in places like Newark or Boston. And what they were doing was experimenting with foot patrols. And so taking officers out of cars and putting them on foot to patrol the same size sectors that they used to be patrolling in cars. And these early experiments at the foot patrol found that it was also ineffective, that it didn't prevent crime from happening. Now, some more recent foot patrol experiments suggest otherwise. If we patrol in a certain fashion, if we use hotspots policing, we might be effective in preventing crime from happening. But this is just another layer of evidence to suggest that random routine patrol across large geographic boundaries that tend to be administrative boundaries based on old census maps, right, we know that this is not effective at preventing crime. In terms of rapidly responding to calls for police service, the idea that we need to get to the scene of a crime as quickly as possible doesn't make sense for a couple of reasons. First of all, several studies have looked into this, and there's found no correlation between response time and either the ability of officers to make an arrest or for crime to be reduced. So these studies suggest that not only are we not arresting people if we get to the scene faster at any real meaningful different rate, we're also not reducing crime by doing this. And this kind of makes sense if you think about the amount of time that passes usually between an incident occurs and the police arrive. So just because a 911 call is placed doesn't mean the police are going to be able to get there a few minutes later. Right? So someone has to call, probably going to have a few minutes between the incident and that 911 call being placed, passing. The operator has to listen to the caller and take down information and enter that information into a computer. That a dispatcher has to notify a unit that an incident is occurring. Hopefully they're around the corner, but very often they're not around the corner and they have to travel to the incident. So in this way, it kind of makes sense that it's very difficult for police to improve the response time to the scene of a crime in a way that's really going to make meaningful differences in either the ability to apprehend offenders or to reduce crime. And then finally, retroactive investigation. And one way to examine how effective we are at retroactively investigating, or how effective retroactive investigations are going to be in terms of exerting the idea that you're going to get caught if you commit a crime, so that we deter people. All we have to do is look at how often we solve index crimes, and we very quickly learn that we don't do a very good job of it. Right? So, and I think these figures are a bit dated. I pulled these from a textbook that I use in my introduction to policing class. But we know, and these might change a bit here and there through the years, but overall, only about 21% of cases are ever solved. 12% of motor vehicle thefts are ever solved. Only 26% of robberies are solved. 63% of all homicides are solved, and that's kind of a bright spot in these data. But generally speaking, we don't do a very good job of actually solving our index crimes. And I think one of the reasons that this is true is because one of the strongest predictors of whether an arrest is going to be made is whether the victim knows the perpetrator. Right? That's the most overwhelmingly important variable that decides whether someone is going to be arrested. And we know that the way that detectives go about their work, there has been some research that found some ways to be more efficient than other ways, but at the end of the day, whether an offender or a victim knows the offender, that's going to very strongly predict whether a crime is solved. Right? So retroactive investigation also is considered kind of an ineffective way of trying to prevent crime or reduce crime from happening in the first place. And so as I said, this standard model is really how most police agencies, even today, operate in the United States. But through the years, there has been a push, even if we continue to rely on this model for our kind of day-to-day activities in law enforcement agencies. Right? It's kind of impossible to tell a police agency that they no longer have to respond to 911 calls. Right? It's just part of the job, and the public expects that the police are going to show up if they place a call and request police services. But in recent years, there's been a push and a move for police agencies to try to engage in more longer-term problem-oriented policing strategies to try to resolve some of the issues that have been long-standing in many jurisdictions. And so John Eck, in a 2006 piece that he published, says that problem-oriented policing fundamentally redefines policing. And I'll just say that the theory behind problem-oriented policing, I think, does essentially fundamentally redefine policing. However, we do have to kind of take a step back and recognize that it's very difficult for police agencies to engage in problem-oriented policing. Now, this isn't to say that we should simply abandon it, because we've seen some very positive results. But I think the evidence suggests, if we go back and look at the modern history of policing, I don't believe that problem-oriented policing has in practice redefined policing. However, it's still become an important component of modern, more evidence-based law enforcement. And so how does problem-oriented policing do this? What problem-oriented policing does is it focuses on what the police are supposed to accomplish, which is to solve problems. In the modern history in policing, what we've focused on in law enforcement is what the police do. And so how we've focused on this is tracking and reporting statistics on police activities, right? Like the number of arrests that they make, or car stops that they do, or stop and frisks that they do. And so I think a great example of relying on this too heavily would be the experience of CompStat in New York in the 1990s. So police leaders at the local level used to go to CompStat meetings and defend themselves and demonstrate that they were doing something by showing these measures of police activity. However, just because police are making arrests and writing tickets and doing stop and frisks, right, is that really the goal of policing? And if we take a look back at history, again, we would say, no, that is not a goal of policing. In fact, Sir Robert Peel, one of his 9 principles, is that the test of police efficiency is the absence of crime and disorder, not the visible evidence of police action in dealing with them. So I just want to point out that Sir Robert Peel didn't actually pen 9 principles. This is kind of a creation of textbook authors who have taken his writings and kind of summarized them, and they became a thing called Peel's Principles. But nevertheless, just looking back in history, we knew even early on in policing that just going out and making arrests and doing stops, right, that does not mean that the police are doing a good job. What we really want is the absence of crime and disorder. And if we can do that without having to rely too heavily on police actions and sanctions, that's when we're doing a good job. Right, so this has been true, and this has been the sentiment in policing from the very beginning, but I think over time we've kind of lost sight of this. And very often we rely on visible evidence of police action and we use this visible evidence of police action as demonstrating that we're doing something about crime. And this has a name in policing. It's referred to as the means over ends syndrome. And this is something that Goldstein talked about in his 1979 piece that I had you read before class. Right, focusing on what the police do rather than what they're supposed to accomplish. Right? This is the means over ends syndrome. And so I'm 14 minutes into this lecture here, so this video here. So what I'm going to do is I'll go ahead and end it, because this is my limit. 15 minutes is my limit for videos to post to YouTube. And I'll pick up in the second video, and we'll talk a little bit more about the means over ends syndrome and what exactly it means for problem-oriented policing. Before I do, I should have mentioned this at the beginning of the lecture. I'm not going to do the quiz as I have done in past weeks. So what I'm going to have you do is hand in a quiz that you're going to complete at the Pop Center website. So I'm not going to be posing questions to you throughout these lectures. You're still going to want to obviously listen to the lectures because it's going to give you an idea of what you need to do in the simulation that you'll do. But I will see you in the next video where we will pick up where we left off.